So good morning, good afternoon, good night. This is Patrizia, the USG Communication Officer. Welcome and thank you for participating the second webinar with Sister Maryanne. I want to thank Maryanne to be so generous, so always available for USG and to support the sisters. We are aware that this is a difficult time for all of us, but during the last webinar, we talked on how to deal with this time, with this uncertain time. Now we decided to talk about how to elaborate, how to deal with this social and personal grief. We feel that this is an important step to go ahead. We are still talking in some countries on the day after. And Pope Francis, during the letter that sent to Vida Nueva, a Spanish magazine, said clearly that this is a time to reimagine, rethink, reinvent perhaps the reality. So we won't go back to, we do not want to go back again to where we were or where we were, but we want to be different. Perhaps our future world can be less unjust and more human. But the first step is to deal with this grief, and perhaps it takes time. So thank you again to Sister Maryanne. But before giving her the floor, we started with a short prayer. The prayer is taken from a letter wrote by an Australian sister, and it's in Italian and English, so you can read it by yourself, just trying to listen the echoes of her words to me. So just listen the echoes. Each of us can write down or reflect on the words that struck us most. This is really a time to listen to us profoundly. So we can start. Sister Maryanne, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, my thanks again to Sister Pat Murray and to UISG for this opportunity to talk with you today. I'm Maryanne Loughry. I'm an Australian Sister of Mercy. I'm a psychologist and I teach in Boston College in the School of Social Work. But right now I'm in a flat in Sydney in quarantine, like many others. Earlier in April, I spoke to many of you and I had the opportunity then to talk about coping and stress and anxiety in these extraordinary times. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to just go over some of that again because some of you haven't heard it. And then I'm going to build on to talk about grief, as Patricia has said, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions. So I'm going to start with what I'm calling a recap, just going over the basic details. So I'm just going to share, Florence, if I can, my screen. So I can show you a couple of slides. Okay? Great, thank you. So what I started in the first session, I used an image. This is a slightly different image, but it has the same message. And I had taken it, as you can see, from the World Health Organization, because I wanted people to know that what I was talking about was something that was being talked about around the world. It wasn't just my thoughts. I was sharing with you the knowledge of experts. The one I used earlier was also distributed by the Red Cross. And the first thing that I started with, and I think I want to still stay with that today, is that at these times, it's absolutely normal to feel stressed and anxious. It's completely normal for all of us at this time to have increased anxiety and worry. Why is that? It's because we are wired. We have been developed as a population that when something stresses us or comes to our attention that we're at risk, we take, our fear builds up, and it's what we have called in the past fight or flight. So we become prepared for dealing with what's coming before us. And in these times, we have been receiving endless messages about COVID-19, a pandemic, and what's going to happen to our society, our family, to us. So it's completely normal that this would make us feel stressed and anxious. What I also emphasized is that there are ways for us to actually cope with some of this anxiety. It's not easy, but there are some ways. And what's been suggested, and it's point number 2 in this PowerPoint here, is to develop a routine and also to reach out and talk to people. Now, terribly important, but also tricky at the moment, because we now, a lot of us have been in shutdown or isolation for some time. So the routine that we might have developed when I talked about this at the beginning of April is now maybe a routine that is taxing us, that's worrying us. We possibly have also exhausted all our social contacts. I know in the first weeks, a lot of us talked to people, to family, to communities in new ways because it was a time of great concern. And now we're still in the situation of being unable to come out. So I think it's still important, the need for us to have routine, to dress, to take our meals, to engage with people at the same times as we would do in our regular life. A third point that I wanted to emphasize, and one that's really, really important, is that we actually, if overwhelmed, look at what our coping mechanism is. Because I'm going to use a term that is a term some of you will know of. It's called hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is when we are anxious and worried, but for a long time. So when I spoke about stress and anxiety early in April, we're now 3 weeks in and it's still the same situation. We have been hyper vigilant to what's going to happen in this pandemic. And that is something that's very hard to maintain. So we could find amongst our communities and amongst ourselves different times when some of us are overwhelmed. Our coping mechanisms that we normally would use are not sustainable. There's an image here on this World Health Organization of turning to smoking or to drinking or drugs. That may not be what we do. Some of us might turn to just eating a lot, or we might take to our bed. This is because some of us, our normal coping mechanisms can be overwhelmed. But what's emphasized is this is now the time to actually reach out to professionals. This could be the time when we might need to talk, and I'm aware that it has to be by phone or by internet, to people who can actually assist us in this time. For those of you who are leaders, you will have sisters and community members who will be overwhelmed by the stress and the worry of the time. The fourth point that I emphasize is for us to have good information. And I know lots of you are receiving information by the social media, by the media. Pick your sources, because if we keep hearing this information, if we hear it and it's too worrying, we'll be more likely to be overwhelmed. And as point number 5 says on the chart, limit our access to what's causing us worry. I'm sure in your countries, as in mine, at the beginning of the pandemic, our leaders, my leader, the Prime Minister, would be on the television every day. And so we'd be watching every day, what's happening, what are they going to say, will we be shut down, when will we be shut down, what can we do? That's important for us to know, but it's also important for us to manage how much we listen to that and when we listen. Because otherwise we are at risk of being, as I've said, overwhelmed or tipped into excessive worry. And the final point, which I covered again in our first webinar, but I think it's equally relevant now, is we have in the past shown that we can cope. We've had problems before in our lives. We may not have ever lived through a pandemic, but we've lived through difficult times, nearly all of us, and we have skills. So return to the skills that have helped you in the past. Some people do simple things like jigsaws, walking, exercise, cooking. They can be things that can help us to moderate our day, help us to manage the levels of anxiety that we have. And some of our skills, knitting, sewing, can actually be very beneficial at this time. Part of the problem for us, though, as you know, at the moment is that we possibly now have been returning to these skills now for 4 weeks, 5 weeks, and we might need to look again for new skills because what we thought would help us is now also getting tide. I also wanted to talk to you about the fact that what's happening at the moment as well is not just COVID-19. What I've become aware of in the last week or so is that life also is going on. So in my community, we've had sisters who've died from natural causes. We've had babies born in families. We've had parents die in my community. We've had sisters fall. But this is happening, this would cause us concern and worry, but it's happening in a time, in a background where there's lots of stress and anxiety going on. And it's causing us to have these strong emotional reactions. What I said also in my first webinar is equally important now. And that's for us to realize that each of us in community, in religious life, in society, deals with stressors like quarantine, lockdown, pandemics differently. There is no one way that we all cope with this stressor, this thing that's causing us enormous stress. Why do we cope differently? We know from research that it's to do with our genetics, our previous experiences in life. It's to do with our resources. It's to do with whether we're extroverted or introverted people. And it's also to do with what supports we have. So no one pattern is the same. And the signs of anxiety in each of us can be very different. Some people will have their hair fall out. Some will get rashes. A lot of people will have stomach complaints. Some people can't sleep. Others can't get out of bed. Some have manic behavior where they're very, very busy, and others have behavior where they can barely do anything. These can all be signs of anxiety. And then what's most relevant, I think, for us, being from so many different countries and cultures, is different cultures also show anxiety and stress differently. They also, and I'm going to come to this, show grief differently. So this can be very, very challenging for us because we're trying to be in contact with each other and we're trying to know our own experience, but it's not always matching what others are doing, and we're not always behaving the same way as others at the same time. What we do know is our anxiety, it's a bit like an ocean, it ebbs and flows. So if we keep watching the media, we can get more and more anxious. If we stop watching the media, we can almost pretend as if nothing's happening. And this can all happen in one day. This can all happen in 1 hour. So people's movements and emotions can change very quickly. I think I've also mentioned to you that sometimes what happens is that people will be showing behavioural change that we're not familiar with in their lives. And that's because of their previous background. I say this to you because I know a number of you have responsibilities for being mindful of communities and how sisters are responding. So each of us is impacted differently, and that's one of the challenges. And then we also now have the challenge of the COVID in different countries. So some of us, like in my country, we're starting to become familiar with the pattern of discussing the curve, the flattening of the curve, the number of positive cases, the number of people in intensive care, the number of people on ventilators. We're starting to recognize the patterns. We're starting to know a little bit whether this is good news or bad news, or how bad the news is. But we also still have countries where the pandemic either hasn't yet come, or the counting that we're familiar with in Spain and Italy and the UK and Australia is not possible. The data is just not there, and yet we're aware that people are impacted. So when we're dealing with communities in different countries, we will be finding it very hard to know exactly what's happening in those countries and where the sisters are up to in terms of their responses to the data that they're receiving. I'm going to now turn to the topic that I'm supposed to be talking about more, which is the one about grief. In the first webinar, I did mention grief. I just touched on grief, and I commented that when I was leaving America because of the pandemic, I had a discomfort about leaving. I knew it was the right thing to do. My government was saying to come home, but I felt uncomfortable, and I named it as grief because I was losing something. I was losing my, I was not going to be with my students. Our university was closing. There was something coming, and I think I referred to it almost like a tsunami was about to come, and I felt an experience of grief. I want to now talk about what that is looking like and how some of the experts are describing it. Many of you will remember and know Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work on grief. That's something that has been familiar to a lot of us. That Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in the 70s and 80s elaborated for us that there were stages of grief. What I've just put up here on the screen is one piece of information that's been developed about grief and COVID-19. And it talks about different stages using the traditional Kubler-Ross stages, like the first stage being denial, and as you can see, moving forward to acceptance. Now, Kubler-Ross's work helped us enormously to actually understand the experience of death. I think it's still helpful for us now, but I'm also going to, in a minute, bring in a criticism. But I want you to have a look, because some of you will recognize from Kubler-Ross and from this handout that I've put up here, the way that it's been described. If you remember, when some of us heard that a pandemic was coming, there were people who denied that this was going to happen, or that it would happen to our country. It might happen to other countries like China, but it wasn't going to happen to our country. That was a classic example of denial. When I was in Boston, so I was with the Americans, there were some people who didn't think it was necessary to go out shopping. We had enough food, things would be fine. What are you talking about? But then over time, people started to see that that could be something that might be helpful to do. I'm not going to go through all of these stages and explain them to you, but you'll see examples of that. We will meet sisters and people who, for example, are angry about the pandemic. They're angry about being locked down. They're depressed. Some people have come to acceptance. I don't think acceptance is a very common experience at the moment. So this is an example that I can share with you, and it can be sent out as a diagram to you later on. But I want to move to more this picture, because Kubler-Ross's work does have a criticism. And the criticism is it's what we call a stage theory, that you move from one theory to the next to the next. And all of us know that that's not quite so. All of us know that we grieve differently. So I've started today by saying people worry differently, they show anxiety differently. Well, I'm also suggesting that we grieve differently, and we don't all grieve at the same time. So this diagram shows you that it's not that we move from bargaining to acceptance to denial, but we move back and forth. That's what emotions are. And the important thing for us to realize is that we don't all do it at the same time. So if I'm grieving about my loss of future, or my loss of self, or the loss of the economy, or the loss of people's jobs, or the loss of sisters, the loss of family members, we move around the different stages. We don't progress and not go backwards. So I think that's one of the most important things that I want to say about grief at this time. And when we have questions, I'm happy to elaborate. I also want to touch on something different that's happened. In recent times, one of the co-authors of Kubler-Ross, a man called Kessler, was asked, what is it that the world is experiencing with this pandemic? What's the discomfort that's out there? And no surprise, because he's a grief expert, he named it as grief, but he elaborated, and that's what I want to do today. He talked about two different sorts of grief. The first he called collective grief, a grief that happens when all of us are experiencing it at the same time. It's when we mourn our lack of normalcy. And Patricia at the beginning talked about what's the new normal? What is our world like now, and what will it be like? Because what it was like before has now changed. And that is a source of grief for us. We know there's a mounting fear, as I've mentioned already, for our economies. We know that our families, the local businesses that we normally deal with, are suffering, and some have already gone under. In my country today, one of the airlines, it was announced, are not going to survive. That has impacts on families, on ways of behaviour, on our lifestyle. We also have had a profound loss of connection. We can't physically embrace anybody, we can't touch people. If we're allowed out to walk, we have to walk with a distance between people. And I've noticed a lot of people keep their head down, they don't engage as much as they might. These are all things that can lead to us collectively grieving what we've had. Some talk of when the pandemic is addressed, will we actually have a better world or a worse world? There was also discussion on the media this weekend, astronauts are returning to Earth. What is the Earth like that they're returning to at the moment? This is collective grief, and it's something that we've experienced before. I want to remind you, I can talk about in my country, Australia, in January, I think some of you saw on the media, we had enormous fires. And the fires ruined a lot of land and killed a lot of animals. And my country was grieving the loss of my country's way of living. Now, the problem for Australians is you've got January, we've had a collective grief of our bushfires, and now we've got a pandemic. Now, we know again from research that when we have big events like this, it's not adding the two together or the three together, it's multiplied. So we've been grieving for some time in my country. But in your countries, many of you have also had experiences of disasters, earthquakes. I think of Italy and earthquakes. And then you have a pandemic. Or I think of times when we had in Indonesia, for example, the tsunami, in Banda Aceh. Or we have deaths of people. I was in Israel when Rabin was assassinated many years ago. They are experiences of collective society grieving. The Rwandan genocide is another very profound time that many of us experienced. What we know is with collective grief, we do survive. September the 11th. We move on, but our world is different and we learn about ourselves and our society. But what's happened with us now with this collective grief is mighty governments have been challenged. It's reported this week, and I know we have sisters from Japan, that the health system is at risk of being overwhelmed. We've seen in Italy and in Spain and in the UK profound numbers of people dying and health workers doing extraordinary work. I don't think any of us ever thought that we would not be able to bury our dead or to visit the sick, but that's what's happening at this time. And worse still, for a lot of us, there's countries where we don't know what's going on, because as I've mentioned earlier, the pandemic and the effect of the pandemic is there, but we don't have the numbers or the statistics. I know in Indonesia, they're counting how many people are buried to just try and understand what's happening in Indonesia. Many people don't get to hospitals, so we don't even know who's getting there. This is uncharted waters, and this is what I'm saying is the causes for collective grief. There's another grief also that we experience at this time, and Kessler's put this out, it's called anticipatory grief. And as you can see from the word, it's when we are waiting for it to happen. The anticipation that this tsunami or this epidemic is going to overwhelm us. It's challenging our own life. I could be taken by the pandemic. You could be taken by the pandemic. So it threatens our very being. This results in a loss of safety. A lot of us don't feel safe anymore. We don't feel safe in our streets if we're allowed out. We don't even necessarily feel safe in our communities. What if somebody brings the virus in? What if one of our staff has the virus? So what's been the facts of our world, what's been what we've rested on and known, has receded. It's challenged us more than we've been challenged before. It's confronted us with our mortality. So if I've said to you in an earlier webinar that we can learn to cope with our worry and our anxiety, but we also know that we can be overwhelmed, it's the same with grief. The grief that we're experiencing, whether it be anticipatory and fear or whether it be collective, is one that we do have the possibility of actually working with to manage. We don't necessarily have to completely succumb. And one of the ways it's been talked about is naming it and claiming it. Naming and claiming. Meaning, this is the time to actually start to share with people using our social contacts, using our people that we are talking to at this stage, and maybe even the professionals if we need to talk to professionals. This is the time for us to name what's happening and to claim it in the sense of what is it that I'm losing or what is it that I've lost that is causing me to grieve. Now, we have over many centuries had practices for grieving. One practice, of course, is funerals. But another practice is memorials, remembering. We remember the Holocaust. We remember World War II. We have days where we remember. We remember the All Souls. So an opportunity now is to actually list, to name, to share what is it that we are grieving at the moment. Because to hold it in and not to share it is something that can actually overwhelm us, as we know from other experiences of grief. And all of us have grieved in the past. All of us have. So what has worked for us to help us to move through our grief? We need to go back to that again. Who did we reach out to? How did we respond? What was helpful? What wasn't helpful? I want to also say another point, which is I'm always aware in talking like this that there are some of us who are possibly a little bit more vulnerable at this time. And often in community, we know those people. They may need a little bit more assistance because not only are they experiencing what we're experiencing at the moment, but they also might still be grieving other losses that have happened recently or not so recently that they haven't addressed. I'll give you a small example, possibly not even a helpful example, but yesterday morning, I was talking to a person who works for the United Nations. And he was describing to me a colleague who's really suffering at the moment and not leaving to do anything, not going out to do any shopping, not talking to people, nothing. And she was in a bad situation. And he said to me, surprisingly, she keeps talking about the fact that she was adopted. Well, in one sense, it's not surprising. What this situation has done has possibly isolated her. And it's brought up past injuries or past stories that have not been helpful. This is one of the things I said earlier, that we all grieve differently. We all experience stress differently because of our backgrounds. So the pandemic is causing us to grieve collectively, but we will do it differently because of who we are and our experiences. They're powerful emotions. There are additional supports, and I've mentioned these a couple of times, of the use of professionals. Now, I'm not saying that we all need this. What I'm trying to say is the vast majority of us have grieved before. We've been in collective grief situations before. We possibly have never been in a pandemic before, but we do know that we're going to get out of this. There is going to be another side. But we are at the moment experiencing profound loss. So there are expressions. In my field of psychology, there is what is called disaster psychology, as there is disaster medicine. There's also what's called trauma-informed counselling. There's also another resource which is called psychological first aid, which is a little bit like medical first aid, where we just learn to talk about our emotions collectively so that we can share what's going on. For those of you who have responsibilities for sisters, I recommend that some of these resources might be helpful. And the other thing I think that's important for leaders, and forgive me if you don't find this a helpful message, but I think it's an important time to know what you can do and what you can't do, because you're also impacted. Your team and you are also part of the collective grief and the anticipatory grief. And it may not be that you're the right ones at this time to actually deliver the comfort that's needed for some of your community members. So who can you reach out to? we have, I'm coming to the end before I open up for questions. We have lost a lot in this pandemic. We've lost not just people that we know and love, family, community members, people from our own countries, routines and jobs, but our natural world has been turned upside down. So we've lost that sense of what our world is about and what we're about. We've lost some of our ministries or the opportunity to minister at this time. We've also, and I'll show you this image, we've also had this experience in Lent. And this was a very powerful image that was shared with me just before Easter in Lent, where you can see our Christ experiencing the COVID. I was very aware on Holy Saturday of our reading of the church. And our reading of the church, if I just can repeat to you a little bit from Hosea, said, "Come, let us return to the Lord, for it is God who has torn and God who will heal us. After 2 days, the Lord will revive us and will raise us up on the third day that we may live before him." And at Easter, God's appearing is as sure as the dawn. Our God will come to us like the showers, like the spring rains that water the earth. So we know that this time will pass. We don't know when, but we know that it will. And when it does pass, we're going to know in much greater detail what our emotional responses. But I just also want to remind you that our faith is a huge resource. But I also want to remind you that many don't have that resource. Many are not gifted with that resource as much as we are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sister Maryanne. I'm very sorry that I didn't introduce you at the beginning. Then I realized that we feel you part of our team, you know, you are accompanying us so many. So I'm sorry for that. Thank you very much for your reflections. What struck me most was the idea of this anticipatory grief, and that the collective grief that, you know, it's not when a community suffers more traumas, different traumas, it's not like a layer over another. It multiplies the trauma.
Yeah.
So this is very touching, you know, and also it complicates the reality. It's interesting also what Pope Francis wrote in this letter to Vidanueva, saying that in a way women have a particular skill to deal it, to accompany, to take care of the details. And he says, when you take care of the details, it's not for death, even though you are accompanying people to die. It's always for life. So I don't know if this new imagination we need to live differently, it might be nurtured from us as women in a different way, you know. If you agree, Mariana, we'll take 2 minutes of silence also to make our translator to rest a little bit and to allow people also to read, to reflect on their notes, and your comments, your questions are most welcome. We are a lot of people, And you can write your comments, your questions on the chat, and Maryanne can read. We can help with the English, with Italian. But if you want, you can also speak, ask your questions. We do not have a room for many people, but I think it's also different to hear the voice of the participants. Okay, so just 2 minutes to rest a little bit, and I will try to put some music. Thank you for your comments, for your questions. I sent you the link to the Spanish magazine to see the letter. As far as I know, it's just available in Spanish right now, but I'm sure it will be translated in the future. Maryanne, if you have the possibility to read the questions in English, so you can decide on which you want to answer to, and I will try to help you with the Italian.
I could take some while you're looking, Patrizia.
Okay.
A couple of things. One that's obviously there is about, as I said, sisters all move at different times through different stages. And there are some sisters who will be, I think it's helpful to call it denial. Some sisters who actually say, everything's fine, I'm fine. We do need to, with sisters like that, do a bit of a reality check, but that can sometimes actually make them more fine. I'm coping, leave me alone. That's what we would classically call a defense mechanism, where they are so vulnerable and at risk of exposure that they've put up a barrier. At this time, unless there's good resources, I wouldn't be working hard to pull down that barrier, because we don't know what we'll find underneath. It's a time of affirming that people are moving at different stages, and it's a time of noting that some people are being unrealistic. But it's not a time to actually, as I say, expose them or make them more vulnerable, unless there's a safety net there. If we were in a setting where we had more opportunity to go out, more opportunity to talk, more opportunity to even, and I use the word a bit nervously, of confront, then I would say, well, we shouldn't let people manage to kind of say nothing's happening. But I'm not sure now's the time to do that because of people being in confined spaces and possibly not with the supports that they need when they are confronted. So that's in response to one question about people who are in denial, but I'm very happy to take some further comments on that. A second one is about ourselves and finding ourselves unduly emotional, like things that you normally wouldn't be emotional about. Easily crying, for example. That's an example of your own raw emotions being at the top. That's an example of how you're coping or not coping. And I think that's important to recognize that that's also okay. It's okay at the moment to be emotional and to be teary, because that might be exactly what your body and your emotions need. It's not easy because it shows your vulnerability, but it's not also something that can be easily covered up. So they're two responses to two things that I've noticed. Patricia,
Mary,
do you have a question that I need to look at?
I would like to translate some questions into English for you.
Okay, thank you.
From the Italian audience.
And my apologies for my lack of Italian. I'm Australian.
Oh, please.
Sorry.
Sister Sylvia asked if it's advisable to share during a communitarian meeting how we are dealing with the grief.
It's a very good question, and I think only you will know the answers. Each community is different. I think depending on the community, I would give people the opportunity to work in smaller groups with people they're comfortable sharing with, rather than in a big setting where they might be asked to say something that they're nervous about saying. So it could be something to do, but there's other ways where people don't actually have to say it out loud. You can write what you're losing. We can put that into a bowl, and it can be just there on the table without ever having been named. So there are ways of sort of surfacing what we're grieving without necessarily saying them out loud. So it depends on the community. I think I would urge people to, if possible, if we were working with the community, to maybe share their concerns with one other, if that's suitable at this time. But I'm also very mindful in this lockdown time that we have sometimes tested each other. It's a time at the moment for compassion, not for challenge. Because if people can't feel comfortable where they are, and we don't know how much longer we'll be in lockdown, you don't want to increase their vulnerability or their feeling at risk. So it really depends on your knowledge of the community and your own knowledge of stress and coping. And we should always let people be free to be silent. I think there shouldn't be pressure at this time, because as I've said, what could be overwhelming somebody is something we're not even aware of. It could be something from early childhood that's come forward. This small example I've given is the one about, I mean, in my own experience, I was in, as I said, Israel when Rabin was assassinated. Now, why on earth that's come back to me, but it has. It's come back as a really strong experience. Now, that's because it was obviously there, and suddenly it's come forth as something I want to talk about. Many people will have stories like that on a big scale, but they might also have stories on a family scale that they're embarrassed to share. So we have to be very careful at this time.
Maryanne, there is a question from Diana. saying that perhaps she has never thought to the anticipatory grief. And perhaps she says it might have to do with the reality of the phase 2 that we are about to start. So I don't know if you can give us some more reflections on these.
The anticipatory grief, it's a little bit like anticipatory anxiety, if I can say that. When we were studying, for example, we would have exams. And as all of you know, if you have an examination at school, you wake up in the morning and most of us have a feeling of concern. Will I do well enough? How will I do? So the exam is the stressor, and it naturally makes most of us anxious. A little bit of anxiety is good. It gets you out of bed. It makes you prepare for your exam. So now we've got this anticipatory grief that's happening, and it's a mixed message because what's happening is our governments are giving us what I call public health messages. Keep a distance, wash your hands, don't touch your face, don't touch metal, the virus lives on plastic, all these messages. But it doesn't give us assistance for how we deal with that from a mental health perspective. So some of us find those public health messages, which are so important, scary. It's a bit like the exam. Will I survive this? If I get the COVID, I'm in the wrong age group. Will I die? We hear that people put on ventilators, 50% of them don't survive. Will I be the 50%? That's that anticipatory, because our safety has been undermined. We no longer feel that we're going to be looked after. So we're anticipating our own mortality. Now, normally in life, that's not as pronounced. If you have worked in some dangerous situations or have lived, as I said earlier, through earthquakes, etc., it's times when you have that sense, will we survive this? But we don't live it every day. But at the moment, in a lot of countries, people are living it every day. And that can be very taxing on our mind and our imagination, and taxing on our capacity to just do daily chores. And what we need to do is find ways to moderate that information so that it's not playing on a loop, going on and on in my mind, so that I can't do anything else. And at different times we'll have that. Like today, I tried to read something and I was aware I was looking at the words, but I wasn't reading. You know, in the end, I had to stop because nothing was going in. That's because my mind is doing other things. But if that continues, it's overwhelming. Is that helpful, Patrizia?
Yes, thank you, Maryanne. And I have other two questions that I found important from the Italian audience, and then we can recuperate some English questions. I want just to invite people, if they want, to take the floor in a few minutes. You can, you have the possibility to unmute your microphone. The questions that I want to highlight are two. It's always about the anticipatory grief, It's, Sister Marina says, it's a way to get prepared. But my question is, it might increase the anxiety within the community. And the other question that is related in a way is there an advisable level of information that we have to share with the community? For instance, Sister Sylvia asked, if I know that we have people who were contaminated by the virus, should I tell the community, or how I can manage the communication?
Yeah. No, thank you. I'll deal with that last one because I think that's terribly important. maybe if I just step back, many of you would know that for a long time, we often kept information from children because we thought the children don't need to know this. But what we've ascertained in recent times is often the children did know what was going on, even though we didn't tell them, because they're picking up our absence of communication or our non-verbals. So the advice would normally be to communicate the information, because often people are hearing the information other ways. They're picking it up in the fact that nothing's being said, or they're picking it up in the fact that they haven't heard from the community that's affected. So the normal advice would be that people are told the information, and are told the information in such a way that they are assisted to hear it and to know that we are there to support them in this time. Now, that's in general what we would say. But if we have information that some people are really going to take this very, very in a very difficult manner, then I think before we do communicate, we need to make sure there's sufficient scaffolding in place. So sometimes if we've been able to travel, that's meant, and I know many of the major superiors will know this, that we've gone to communicate in person, so they know the gravity of what we're saying. Now, in these times, if we can't do that, we have to think, what's the alternative way to do this communication so that people can not only hear it, but have the opportunity to question it, and maybe to hear it several times before they really understand it. There is no one answer, but I think it's important for leaders in particular to think about how in the past we've communicated difficult news and what's worked and what hasn't worked. But to actually just not give the information is probably not the best mechanism unless that's all we can do at this time. So I'm not saying it's not an option. It could well be an option. But do realize that later on when the communication comes, people will say, well, why didn't you tell us? Did you doubt me? Did you think I couldn't manage, etc.? So there'll be implications either way. So I just want to acknowledge it's a very good question and there's no right answer. But the default position would be for us to hope that people can manage the information if the scaffolding or the supports are in place to help them to digest it, to take it in, to understand it. If at this time that's not there, then maybe it's not the right time. But you will each know with your own communities about that. A related comment is, I did comment last time that some people will be so fearful of the virus that they won't be able to overcome that fear and relate to sisters who they think could put them at risk. And I think that's something we have. So if sisters are living with sisters who are going out, who possibly are nurses or frontline workers, we can't presume that the sisters staying at home can rationally address that, because some peoples will be overwhelmed by fear. And we have to accept that. It's not something that we can say, well, they need to pull themselves together. Because as I said, this is a time when people will be overwhelmed.
Thank you very much, Maryanne. What you're saying echoes many experiences that we have been listening. I told you that we would change the language, but there is a very interesting question from Erika. She's a secretary of a bishop, and she says a very interesting question. She says, we lost a priest recently, and the answer of all the community was just silence. Is there a way to deal with the grief as community, as a diocesan community? Thank you, Erika.
No, it's there's many different ways. I saw earlier also there was a comment about going to a funeral on the internet. Last week I did that. A friend of mine died not related to the COVID. He'd been a worker in the L'Arche communities, and so lots of us went to his funeral by the internet. And it was very poignant and emotional, even though I was here in my apartment doing so. On Saturday, a friend told me about a family that had the death of a woman who was a good woman in the church here in Sydney, and they got together by Zoom and they did a memorial. They talked about Margaret and how she had been in their lives, etc. They are replacements for us not being able to mourn at the moment in the church as we would for a funeral, or as in some cultures when we go to a family home and possibly have a cup of tea, or in some places even a stronger drink, and remember the stories of the person. So I really think that people can be invited to alternatives that maybe have to be by Zoom at the moment, or for them to write in memorials that they have for a person. I think that these passings have to be acknowledged. And it's what I was saying, it's a bit like the naming and claiming. We only grieve if we actually have the opportunity to use what we've done in the past in a new way. So through, as I say, a memorial, or some people are saying, look, once this pandemic's over, we'll all get together and talk about the person who's just died. I think to do it now as well is important. So, but of course, what works best for a diocese, or what works best, not everybody will join in, because not everybody will either feel the need or possibly even have the emotional capacity to do it.
Thank you, Marianne. I would like to give the floor to Maria Piacciotta. He sent a very interesting question, and I think it's worth it. She can speak directly. She can unmute her microphone, and I want to invite her to speak very slowly in order to be translated into English. Thank you, Maria. Go ahead.
I will try to speak slowly, and just in case I'm too slow, you ask me to slow down. And what I think, what I perceive, is that inside our congregations, obviously, there are different kinds of grief. There is the older member who perhaps is feeling very bad because the virus can determine her own life. So what we live in this case is a closing, a total closure in front of being afraid for this situation. And on the other side, we also have a big proportion of the community, younger sisters. Not to say that the older members are not asking themselves the same question, or they do not feel, in this sense, consecrated life, but their being older is prevailing somehow. But in other cases, grief is about our consecrated life. So we have been called to give ourselves. And but in this way, all of a sudden, we found ourselves closed, locked down, maybe also for the necessities of the older sisters who perhaps are more fragile, and maybe a motivation which is good. It's good enough, but to a certain amount, a center point. Sorry. And in the past days, I was reading an article by Barrico, and he was saying this passing through several steps, from prudence that can allow us and has been allowing us to read all the indications that we received, but also reading lives, the griefs, and all the echoes of fraternity, to being a little bit audacious, that helps us not to die. And I would say that not to think just of us, if everything is going well for us, as the Pope said, but then what happened to the others? I do not care what happened to other people. So I was asking myself, this passage, this stage, this passing through, should be elaborated gradually and perhaps discerning the different among different situations that allow consecrated life to express what this is, and perhaps also the giving ourselves, being precautious, because we do not have not precautious. So giving ourselves as a gift can become an answer to the grief, and perhaps also allow ourselves and each congregation, each one of us, to live. I was thinking of what we were discussing the other day in the Gospel, Thomas, while the doors were shut for the fault of the Jews, they were scared, they were afraid of dying, and also we are afraid of dying, but God enters the door, opens the door, and sends the Spirit that sends us. Sorry.
Okay.
Thank you very much, because this is a question that also other sisters are asking. So thank you, Maryanne, for helping us.
I would just begin, but I don't have an answer. But I ended by saying that we have a particular one of the resources that we bring to this pandemic is our faith, and not everybody has that. Some people don't believe in an afterlife, they don't believe in God, and so they're going to be facing this pandemic differently. And our scriptures talk about our forebears, the people in the past, having had similar experiences of drought and of famine and of feeling that God wasn't there, and that God has come. And in our New Testament, we know in the form of Jesus. So I think we do have a particular gift to give as people of faith. And then, as you rightly say, consecrated people, we also have a particular, I mean, in many senses, even though this is particularly difficult for us, we're often still a resourced people. Like, we have a security. I mean, I know it's been undermined by the pandemic, but we have an identity, we have a security, and we have supports. One of the things that's coming through very strongly at the moment is the need for our world to see compassion, for us to be people who are reaching out to those who don't have the same gifts, not just because that's the right thing to do, but we even know now from psychology that that is a way of addressing our concerns. We feel good when we minister to somebody. There's something that actually helps, again, what I've called our wiring, what's happening in our brain. Acts of charity and good work help us to feel better about ourselves. So I think we're in a good place to do that. But you bring up a very important point, that we are intergenerational. So within our congregations, we have older members who have lived a long life and who have wisdom, but they also are a little bit more at risk. I'm not recommending this, but I know that in my own congregation, we've been asked to partner with somebody that we ring on the telephone and just check in to see how they're doing. And I was given a woman who I didn't know very well and I haven't worked with before, but it's been a great gift to ring her up and to say, how are you going? What's happening? And I've learned a lot more about her life than I ever would have done before. We don't do it for a long time, but it's just a nice thing to do. So I think there's little ways, and I think that intergenerational, younger people are thinking about the pandemic differently to older people. And it's helpful for us to share that wisdom of the younger and the older so that there can be a perspective on what's going on. It doesn't mean we'll all in the end have the same perspective, but we might come to understand different perspectives. But in terms of where this will situate us moving forward, religious life is giving a lot. I'm not sure I'm in the position at the moment to say what this is going to say back to us. But I think as Patricia said at the beginning, we're not going to necessarily be the same after this for many, many reasons. And that's going to give us reflection. It's going to give a lot of us reflections about what's necessary and what's not necessary in life. But I think also it's something that others have lived through before. Many people have told me, especially with our older sisters, that they have seen war and they know what war teaches you about priorities. And so I'm thinking that some of us who are younger are learning what they've already learned and are experiencing it. And it's how we share that richness together that's important. So I thank you for the fact that this is challenging now religious life and what we have to contribute. I repeat, I think we do it from a position of strength. Even though we're challenged, we have so many resources that other people don't have. And that the more we reach out, the more it's given back. And I think that that's something that also helps us at this time. So thank you very much for your reflections and question.
Grazie. Grazie.
Thank you, Maryanne. Josephine, do you want to talk? No, okay. We have some minutes yet. We are going towards the closure of this profound webinar. And I don't know, Maryanne, if you want to give a look at the chat, if there are some questions that inspire you for questions, or if we have participants, like one or two, who want to comment or ask questions briefly.
Maybe can I just comment on one here? The one, it says in Tanzania, we're not yet in lockdown, but everyone is anxious about what next. I think what we're learning is that there are lessons to be learned from different countries. And so Tanzania and other countries can learn what we've already learned. Now, what we've already learned is the importance of listening to our public medical people. And I think that's very, very important. I mean, my own congregation has sisters in Papua New Guinea, and we're just very mindful that they don't have the same medical system that we have here in Australia. So what do our communities have to help them to feel safer? But then the same thing is for sisters in countries to know that this is going to be an experience that's going to be rapid, that there will be restrictions, that we will have the emotions I've been talking about. So I think we can help people to get ready in their anticipating the problem. We can also say to them, that we're there for them in as many ways as we can be. So I think we're now, what I'm trying to say is I think we've now learnt some lessons. Patricia, I'll try to find it, but there was a letter sent from one of your writers in Italy who wrote to the British saying, in a week's time, this is what you will be talking about. And that was so helpful for another country talking to another country. Now, clearly, what happened in Italy is going to be different in Tanzania, and probably was a bit more similar writing to somebody in Britain. I'm very mindful that this virus is going to really cause a lot more damage, unfortunately, in countries that don't have good medical systems. So I'm very aware of that. But I think we congregations that have sisters are now in a bit of a position to explain to them how we're going to support them and what we now know, so that they know what to anticipate. And I'll go back to my silly example that I mentioned earlier about exams. It was always helpful when I had a school exam to know it's going to go for 1 hour. There'll be 5 questions or whatever. It just helps you to know what you need to anticipate, what you need to be ready for. We have that expression in English, forewarned is forearmed. So knowing can help you, but you need to know in a way that means we're there with you to support you. So as people in Tanzania or in Russia or in Burkina Faso or whatever experience now the pandemic, we who've had some of these experiences need to be in solidarity, but also to inform them. And we can tell them things like what it is going to be stressful, they are going to be anxious, they are going to get through it. So we can offer them some of that advice. I'm not saying it will be completely adequate, but it's better than nothing.
Thank you, Maryanne. Thank you very much. Participants are writing in the chat to thank you. And I'm sorry, that we have very interesting questions that we cannot answer, but we will find a way to do that, because there are very key questions in the chat for religious life, because we are not just talking about the grief in general, we are talking about the grief within our life.
Yep.
The Pat, she's still online. I don't know if she wants to say something at the very...
No, I just want to thank Maryanne for her generosity and also for her insight, and for giving such practical responses to the, if you like, the different moments that we're experiencing, both at an individual level and in community. And I think one of the things we can do for sure is to share our own insights and resources. I've been taking notes here, and I said, it might be very helpful that we share your charts and share some key information that you've given to us, and make it known to those with whom we work or family members. Or there are new ways, I think, this moral imagination that I think we're challenged to find new ways as we move forward, new and creative ways of working with the older sisters in our community, with those who are younger and who will want to move out, for example, more quickly. There are, I see in the chat some very key questions there of managing difference. And I think maybe it's something we can reflect on together in the future, of how we manage. Grief is managed differently, but so too anxiety, but so too as we're re-emerging into a new world. And also thinking, I think, of how we're going to ritualize differently. You've pointed to different ways of celebrating memorials, of being together, of how to do ministry differently. I was just saying, I'm struck by several groups who maintain contact with, say, refugees or migrants they're working with, or poor people by WhatsApp. So reassuring people, connecting with them. So I think we have to begin this process for ourselves, for our ministry, and for our service as religious. This is a new challenge and a new frontier that we're facing, and God walks with us in this time of resurrection to actually see how we birth the new.
Thanks, Pat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sister Pat. Sister Pat has also the responsibility to answer to the many questions and issues that congregations and sisters are writing to her. So thank you very much. I feel very sorry because there are really a lot of interesting questions and also issues for us as a USG. So I will take care of that, and I will share it with Sister Pat and the President, so they can find a way to answer your questions. Thank you again to Sister Maryanne for our second meeting. For us, it's really a blessing. It's not just a blessing to listen to you, but it's a blessing to be all together in this space, because we are all separated. So it's an opportunity to be together and to nurture our sisterhood. We are going to close. I want to thank also my colleagues, Sister Florence and Claudia. We can't see Claudia. I don't know if she can appear, but she's translating for us. So thank you very much. And we will plan other meetings, and we are thinking to have a webinar inviting 2 speakers to see how our faith and our spirituality, our charism might help us, might accompany us in this time. So it's not just to deal with the negative or with the suffering, but also trying to move towards and how we can be nurtured and animated by our faith and our spirituality. So we will send you more information once we have everything set. Thank you for your participation, for your trust. And I will put the recordings on our website. I cannot send it to you because you didn't register. So you will find it in a few days in our website, and feel free to share it. Okay? Thank you.